Hey, what's happening there, Golden Bears? We're in our final two lessons of the Civil War. So with that, let's go ahead and jump on in. This is a great quote showing kind of the anger on one hand and the consternation of the entire Northern abolitionist movement by Susan B. Anthony, basically saying, look at all of this, all of you. You hear me swear that I will cut off this right arm of mine before I will ever work for or demand the ballot of the Negro and not the woman. This is a tension point that has emerged at the end of the Civil War on the eve of the 14th Amendment, giving African American men the right to vote. She is almost incredulous. She is incredulous the fact that how is it the African American man who was a slave just on the eve before has the right to vote before her, who are educated and been part of the system and have been trying to be about abolition movement since the very beginning. If him, why not both of us? So with that, that continues to convey kind of the deep drawn division that America was in prior to the Civil War and during the Civil War, and has frankly been after the Civil War. A couple of things to help you as you consider this handout 5.7 and dealing with the Reconstruction of the South is that there are three basic people groups that we need to have in mind, and one of them is the poor whites, the next the African American experience, and the third one is that of the landowners. I want to give you a few tips or suggestions of how to fill this in, not complete, but at least give you a sense of an idea. Under living conditions for the whites, don't forget that you have sharecropping to put in there. Underneath that, their political power was often based in seeing the redeemers who were coming to redeem the South and bring it back to its original glory. We have under the African Americans, their living conditions, they had to live under Jim Crow and the black codes that were enacted to keep them from voting. You see their political party was definitely that of Republicanism and Lincoln. And then for the landowners, I guess we can say that they needed the labor in order for their crops to be able to grow and to emerge and to flourish. And they're the ones that actually enacted and passed the Jim Crow laws that we are involved with. Now to a story that hopefully will help capture a little of the frustration that is happening during this situation. Back in the day when I still had hair and before marriage and kids and all that, I just graduated from college, these cell phone plans were now becoming not just for the wealthy who they were so big walking around, they'd have side packs and everything else. They kind of became, manageable and within reach. And you just had to make choices as young college graduates if you want to spend that much money for the effort to use. But the plans originally when they first came out, it wasn't like it is now, where you're all in, all data, all everything. We had to make choices that you can allow. One time you had a plan that you're only allowed to have 15 to 20 phone calls a month. Seriously. Or beyond that, you started paying per minute. Or you're only allowed so many texts per month. Or if you one other plan developed that if you had others that were on the same network as yours, you can call them free, but anybody else outside of that you had to pay. When it was the most confusing and challenging things to keep track of. What was even more sad is that if you, let's say, signed up for LA Cellular, which was one of the initial in the area that eventually got bought out by AT&T, that eventually got bought out by, T-Mobile. I don't know where AT&T went. But each plan, when you signed up for it, the moment you put your name on the dotted line, you were committed to that for a 2-year plan or a 1-year plan, depending on how much you want to pay. But you didn't know if the plan would work or not. So seriously, you go, it's there, you try it out in the work, great. At the sales place, you would go home or to your workplace, you go, oh man, there's no service here. So you go back to them and say, hey, what can we do? They go, sorry, you signed a contract, you can't get out of it. And so it was a very frustrating thing that here you have great ideas that this is going to bring liberty to your life. It's going to give you maybe safety and security with our lives. But in reality, it brought you a further shackle and a bill that you just felt like a sour taste in your mouth as to what was left over. This is exactly what it was like of this Reconstruction era of the South. There were a lot of hopes that it was going to work, but the end of it all, there was a lot of missed promises, short-term gains for long-term failures, and let's hope we unpack that in such a way that might make better sense to you. Well, in this early form of Reconstruction in the South, you have two people groups that are emerging following the Civil War. One are the Scalawags, which they're the ones that are willing to, in this derogatory word, scalawag, were the ones who were like, well, since the Union won to the North, why don't we just go ahead and do what they say, and it's time to reform what we're doing down here. I'm in agreement with what they're doing, and let's join in with them. Then there's another group of people called the Carpetbaggers who were brought down. Think of them as like out-of-town tourists here in Temecula. Like, we love that they go to our restaurants and go to our establishments, but we're like, dude, all these tourists just cause traffic problems for us. We kind of wish you weren't here. So it's like, no, we live here. We kind of wish you wouldn't come here to stay, let alone come here to live. So the Scalawag are local people, born local, that are saying, I agree with the North. The Carpetbaggers are people who move here or move south there to hopefully infiltrate the mindset of redeeming and changing how things were done in the South. Well, in this time, we see in the early trial period that there are African Americans who are attempting to exercise their hard-won freedoms. And what happens as they continue to go and try to maybe engage in the voting booths or engage in their church communities to create lasting change, or maybe to go create opportunities through the Freedmen's Bureau, if you remember in the last time I talked about it, to go and find their children that were taken from them, or go find their wife that was taken from them, or to create new opportunities in other regions like Kansas or in the North. They often faced hostility towards their movement. But there were some situations in the South, now that they were allowed to participate in various voting and elections, that they did begin winning offices. And in fact, by 1877, at the end of the Reconstruction era, some figures say that in South Carolina alone, over 2,000 men had found a way to serve in either local offices, all the way up to the state legislature. And some states even had federal legislature. I know California had a minority, and I want to say Louisiana had someone at that same time. But not each state in the South had that much of reflection in that. Why? Because remember, South Carolina was predominantly African American. At one point, it was 90-something% African American. So their votes alone were going to obviously overshadow of the whites who were living there. That wasn't the case in Georgia, where they were just under 50%. So this is some of the, the disparity going on between the South and the Reconstruction there. I'll go over that with my Steger Select group of people as we go. Oh, this is a really sad political cartoon done by Nast, who was there talking about the commentary of how the South was seen. And so here you can see the man in the middle, the tall guy there with his Confederate belt buckle there, talking about unifying there as a nation. You have the guy on the right that has a number 5 on there, talking about 5th Street and how Wall Street has been involved with this. The guy on the left, just an immigrant there. All three of these people groups are doing what? They're on the backside of a soldier, of a Union soldier, African American, who had fought to liberate. And there in the background, you can't barely see them, but you see a freedmen's school burning, and you also see a church burning. And in kind of the foreground, between the left shoulder of the tall guy, you see children hanging on lampposts there. This is the message that is being conveyed and sent across the landscape of the South, that you might have think you won, but you're going to change nothing here in the South. Well, interestingly enough, there are different coalitions that begin forming between the African American community and some Southerners, poor Southerners typically, or these are what we would call the Scalawags. And here they saw the beauty of working together, and so finding ways in which the public sector can work within the freedmen's community to begin giving opportunity for African Americans and the poor to find a way to improve their life. This was on a random scale, and it was not done equally across each state line. Now, what also happened is that the extension of suffrage benefited more to the white man in this situation than it ever did to that of the African American man. I'll talk about this in my Steger Select and how there were some serious problems between the whites, African Americans, and the landowners under this Reconstruction time period. What are some other things that we need to recognize is that the premise of the slavery being canceled was quickly duped into thinking by the white plantation owners that, okay, you might have your freedom, but what if we come up with a new model that gives you your freedom but also ties you to the land? And so this idea of sharecropping emerges because the Freedmen's Bureau and the whole plan of that Sherman had come up with to distribute 400,000 acres, those things weren't materializing. And remember, that was the Public Order 15 in the last lecture. That land distribution did not take place. It was for a limited amount of African Americans that got it. And so what was the result of this? Is that many blacks, African Americans, and poor whites had to turn to sharecropping in order to survive. What was sharecropping? Well, essentially saying, hey, boss, I'll work for you if you let me live still in the same premises. You give me a loan to plant my crops. I will work for myself. You let me use your tools, or I'll buy them from you or rent them from you. And then at the end of the year, I'm going to give you a percentage of my crop to repay you back for what I've done. Now that works great if there's no competition for the cotton or no competition for the wheat or the rice, and not with taking the competition that Europe had. What happened on the years in which there was greater competition? They're borrowing at a rate when cotton is worth this. What happens in the subsequent years when cotton is now worth this? That there becomes the rub. That means they are now beholden to the white man who owns them for that percentage, and until they have a chance to pay that back, that wasn't ever going to happen because the white southern planters made sure that the rates will get lower and lower and lower, or the prices of cotton will pay only less and less and less because they need them tied to the land. And so this is just a new system that still keeps them tied to the land and is a new kind of form of virtual slavery. Well, despite the limitations that sharecropping did, despite the many hardships of this, despite the difficulty of many African Americans forging out a new path, despite even the poor whites having a chance to get out of this, there were small opportunities of African Americans, if they chose to leave the South to go to Kansas. Now remember Bleeding Kansas and John Brown, and was he a saint or a sinner? Was he a patriot? A patriot, or was he our first terrorist? Remember there's the abolitionists to try and free, those taken that new territory of Kansas and Nebraska. Well, some African Americans says, I'm going to start a new opportunity. I'm tired of the oppression that the white elites are doing over my life. Even the poor whites are doing over my life. Let's move to Tech, Kansas and see if there's a new start. And so this is a very interesting group of people called the Exodusers that are creating a new space and a new frontier for them. We'll talk about them in a later dynamic, but for right now, that's just where we want to keep it at that point. Well, what we began to discern in the South through this white resistance movement beginning to emerge is that they weren't too keen on having the North, the radical Republicans, if you will, tell them what to do. And they began to question the legitimacy of this Republican Reconstruction. And they began to recognize that all these changes they were doing was only raising taxes for them. They felt like all they were doing was taking care of the African American people through the schools and the hospitals and other social services. And they discovered that many of these Republicans who were coming down to help rebuild the South were the same owners of the companies that were paid for by the government to do these projects. So for instance, maybe the Republican representative of Illinois is the owner of a said railroad construction company that is being paid to come down here and install new railroad lines in the South. They knew how much they were getting paid. There was no competition. And so these are a lot of discoveries that was happening at that time. And so they were able to claim foul, and we don't trust what was taking place from the Northerners and with their taxpayers. What did this give them? More ammunition to kind of declare how unfairly they've been treated. Why are they not giving these jobs to the Southerners rather than to the Northerners? It just goes on and on and on. And the last thing that you need to recognize here in this white resistance movement here before we move on is that because the Democrats, after the first 7 years have passed, it only took them 7 years, they began getting elected back into office because of the Lincoln and Johnson plan and only demanding of 10% of the people, the Wade Davis bill demanding 50, but that getting vetoed. Over time, you begin seeing the radical Republicans just going, we're tired, we're weary, can we just get on with running a country and let us be unified? And in that, so the same people who they were fighting with 7 years ago now find themselves elbowing up there in the political offices, and this is something that we begin seeing the march towards the Reconstruction coming to a kind of a complete failure at this situation. What begins happening is that these redeemers who were part of the Republican Party or part of the Democrat Party, who were moderates, are calling themselves the redeemers, to redeem back what was once ours. And so they begin passing laws and more of them getting elected into it. How do they get elected into that? Because they use violence and intimidation and black codes, etc., to prevent African Americans or poor whites from going to the ballot box. You see the growing ugliness of this new group of the Ku Klux Klan that were using acts to, prevent people from voting. And despite government passing the Force Acts that in 1870, 1871 to kind of as a response to these vigilante attacks, it did not do anything to change anything. Very few people faced prosecution or were convicted, and if they were, other organizations were found out in their place. So what emerged out, they said, fine, you don't want us to be KKK groups? We'll start a gun club, we'll start a dance club, we'll start a mission society. And it was there that they used those clubs to disguise what their true meaning and what their true purposes were. This here is evidence, not evidence, but of another ad there where, okay, you carpetbaggers, okay, you scalawags, you carpetbaggers want to come down from the north? You want to come and live amongst us? You want to come and make changes amongst us? Hey, we'll lynch you just as we will anybody else who wants to come down here. So it's a definite grip that the white Southerners had in order to bring back this resistance to the Reconstruction. So by way of conclusion, there were, under Andrew Johnson's plans that were carryover from President Lincoln's, there were attempts to bring about some lasting short-term successes. But in the end of it all, the Southerners organized and resisted effort after effort after effort of the radical Republicans to keep them from joining in politics and continue helping their Southern mindset continue to grow down there in the South. Well, let us continue on Module 5.8. This Reconstruction basically gets undone. With that, there is a worksheet that you have that you should kind of consider, and I'm going to give you some help on this type of things for you to consider if you want. So for instance, under the West, North, and the South, notice how many region goes and gets impacted or touched by such a thing. So some ideas for the West and the social problems that they had. The exodusers that I've talked about in the last lecture are moving out there, and really more immigrants are also being drawn. Going down, what are some political conditions that you should consider? Maybe the Homestead Act that was giving away 160 acres to people who show up out there and meet the qualifiers. And then under economic conditions out in the West, remember that Transcontinental Railroad that begins to transform not only the West, but also its importance and influence. We'll talk much more about that in another time period. Well, how about the North? How did they change and the region change because of the Reconstruction coming to an end? Well, one way is the growth and expansion in the cities. For political cartoons, there's so many things taking place in the political conditions there, but one of them is corruption becomes a rampant concern. And then the last one, under economic conditions, we see growth of factories emerging there in the north. And then how about the south? How did the south, with the end of Reconstruction in 1877, how were they affected? Well, segregation continues. We now have, in the political conditions, we go from black codes to Jim Crow laws, and then the last box of economically, we still see this sharecropping continuing as its main thrust of economic motive. My story here on the failure, I like to say, of the Reconstruction goes way back to my days when, in my little neighborhood of growing up in H-Town, when we first moved there, it was just about maybe 60 homes, and we were surrounded on three sides of orange groves. It was a cool spot to grow up in, so you can always go play in the groves, and just had forts and games and all sorts of activities to be creative. Well, as one neighborhood, one group of trees were ripped out to make a new neighborhood, we would, my friend Scotty and I would go over there in the summer, and we would take discarded pieces of wood and we would haul them, literally, like to a different section. It's probably about a quarter of a mile away. We would haul that wood on the backs of our bike or on a little wagon contraption we hooked up, and we would take them to the middle of one of those orange groves because we didn't want the older kids finding out what we were doing there, and we would build our own little cool fort. And here we were, we had built it, we had the steps going up to it, we had the cool platform, we started kind of building the sides, we had brought a little carpet remnant up in there, and we came back, and this wasn't all in one day. This probably took us 3 days in the hot summer sun to do this, but it was really cool because you had the canopy of the orange trees above you, you had the deck to sit on. It was like the coolest spot for us to go and have lunch. We remember going there in one morning to see how it was doing, to try and continue, and someone had gone there and tore it all out, ripped it down. And we don't know if it was the older kids in the neighborhood, it might have been the workers in the orange groves, but all I can tell you, we were really frustrated about that. We said, let's not get that too bummed out. I said, hey, Scotty, let's try a different idea. So on the other side of our house was this little this ravine that led to a base of a nice mountain that we used to go hiking up and try to capture garter snakes and lizards and other things. And it was there that there was this ravine that had been washed out by the rains over the many years. And I said, what if we changed, instead of having a fort, what if we built like a tunnel type thing? So, and he's all, that sounds cool. So we started doing the same thing, looking for scrap woods at all the construction sites. We would haul them down to this section, and then we started, building it over the ravine. And it wasn't, very big, but for small kids, it was just big enough. And we lined it with carpet. We had everything in there. It was the coolest spot. And in the hot summer months, it was actually cooler there than maybe in our homes because our parents were too poor to pay for air conditioning. It was awesome. Well, then comes a summer August storm and the rains hit, back in the monsoons. And we didn't really think anything of it. We come back the next day. Nothing was left of our fort. The roof had been ripped out. You could see remnants of it out of the guy's field that it was dumping into. And we felt so saddened, and we felt so ripped off, both by mankind and now by Mother Nature for this thing. And so we just felt like we gave up, and we just walked away. And I don't think we ever went and built another fort as a result of that. We were on to other types of things. So this is the mindset, I believe, that by 1877, with all the complications that America has after the Civil War, the financial and economic and the railroad issues that we have, America frankly gives up. And this is what many would argue is a failure after the Civil War. Well, the retreat from Reconstruction, we begin recognizing in the North, they're like, yeah, we fought for the abolition. We all paid a major price tag for that. We sent our own sons and daughters down there to help liberate and to bring America the 13th and 14th and 15th Amendment. But you know what? We don't want you moving up here to live next to us. We don't want you up here moving to take our jobs. You begin seeing a lot of nativism between different immigrant groups towards the African Americans. So there is that interesting idea that they're like, emancipate. Yeah, we could see the value of that. But when it comes down to pragmatic sense, most Americans were not keen on being that racially integrated. at this time. So that's one challenge that they had. And then we also have the presidencies that are either being accused of being corrupt or being relatively weak. And we're going to have another presidency, I don't know if I skipped it too hard here, that I'll talk a little bit later on, that is going to be encountering some problems, and they're going to have to compromise. Well, we also begin seeing a challenge that I like to highlight is, yes, by asking the South, and the South losing, this 3/5 clause, if you remember, way back when, in our first compromise of 1820, we said, well, we'll agree to this if we keep the North and the South separate, but, they only count as 3/5. Well, now with the end of the Civil War, guess what? Those 3/5 now count as 5/5. And so ironically, the Southern elitist politicians, they certainly don't want to give any rights to the African American, but they certainly want each person counting as one whole person. Why? Because that is what's going to help them gain the majority of representatives back when we get into the Congress, etc. So this is an interesting irony that I'm sure the Northerners thought of, but they couldn't do much about it because of these clauses. Well, in the midst of this, we have here by 1873, we have a major railway that is going to begin, the Northern Pacific, that is going to begin facing some crises. I don't want time to go into this crisis of the Panic of 1873. We'll be talking about some of these other railroads when we move further into the next time period. But because of this panic and because of the company going bankrupt, there were over 500,000 workers that were either displaced or that were frustrated or who were saying, we're going to go on strike. And in order for the government to keep products moving and to keep the country moving forward, the president had to step in, and he brought soldiers and took them out of the South. Remember the five zones of the South, took them from the South and said their job, those soldiers, is to make sure these strikers in the North and the West don't keep creating problems for us. Well, that leaves a vacuum for those in the South to say, oh, wow, no one's here to enforce these different rules? Wonder what we're going to do about that. Another retreat that we can see, so we have the president retreating, we have the economics forcing it to retreat. We now have this group called the Taney Court. Taney is the Chief Justice of this time period. He's from the South. There's 4 or 5 other Supreme Court justices who are from the South who have had slaves themselves. They are beginning to make court case decisions that weaken the opportunity for the African American Civil Rights Acts that were passed following the first round of the Civil War. For instance, the slaughterhouse cases of what they're called, they basically narrowly defined the 14th Amendment to say, okay, we're going to leave it up to the states to determine who has the right to vote and who doesn't have the right to vote, okay? And then the U.S. versus Cruikshank basically stated that, we know and have seen that each state sometimes have abused their power, like the Black Codes, the Jim Crow laws, etc. Okay, we're going to make sure that the state doesn't make those abuses continue, but we're going to allow the groups like the KKK and these other small fringe groups that we can't take away their autonomy. They can kind of do what they want. So what does this enable? U.S. versus Cruikshank? It enables these small private groups to become political and machines of their own right, to become very oppressive machines outside the law. And this is, what does this basically do? The Taney Court shuts down almost every right African Americans experienced as a benefit from the Civil War. So you can see a further retreat taking place. And we see then this new election of another president, and what essentially happens is it comes to a draw. And at this draw, they have these different controlled of the senators have to come together. So they create a joint electoral commission. You have 7 Democrats, you have 7 Republicans, 1 independent, and they come to a decision as to who they will vote for. Well, ultimately, they say we want Rutherford B. Hayes to be president. But the Congress, controlled mostly by the Southerners, didn't like this. So as part of this compromise, The Southerners said, we will vote for Rutherford B. Hayes if you get yourself out of our backyard and you stop this idea of Reconstruction. Get rid of the 5 zones, send your soldiers out, since you've already sent them out anyways because of the panic of 1873 and the railroad crisis, etc. We want to start doing our own thing. What did they do? They're like, fine, we want Rutherford B. Hayes that much. We'll abandon the African American people. We'll abandon all the changes that have gone in. We'll abandon the Freedmen's Bureau. We'll abandon all those things. Why? Because we have bigger problems, namely economics, to worry about, more so than the rights of African Americans down there. What does this do? Yeah, it averts a crisis for the short term. What does this then do for the long term? Huge damage for the African American and the poor whites that are there in the South, as though nothing was different at the end of the war, of the Civil War, than it was at the beginning. Yes, they are freed, but they now still have sharecropping. They now have even greater degree of punishment from the KKK groups and other hate groups that were emerging during this time. This is something we will do during Steger Select. And so what is the legacy, the lasting legacy, as we come to a close of the Reconstruction era? Some can argue there was some change. To some extent, there was a little bit of change. And you can see there that even though the African Americans didn't receive ownership, they did have some economic independence. Some free people did get rights, but not everything was done equally at the federal and state levels for them. You can see the Republican Party switched its parties from economics, from the racial stuff. You can see there that the racial equality didn't run deep in the North, so they were ready to stop interfering in the South. The women didn't get the right to vote, and because of the Taney Court, many of the things about the 14th and 15th Amendments were shortened or made narrower to make it easier for businesses, and especially groups based on racial prejudice, to operate in the South. What about some other things that also occurred? That slavery was abolished. There were some freedoms. Southern states were modernized. You can see the whole list there. But essentially the question you have to ask yourself is this: to what extent was Southern society changed by Reconstruction? And I would hope that as you come away from this, you begin to clearly see is that by the end of 1877, the Civil War that disrupted the entire United States, brother versus brother, father versus son, mom versus child, etc., okay, all of that was for a lost cause and a moot point. We weren't able to, the landowners didn't change, the South remained the same, they still had their political power, they still had a hold over politics and influence over the South. There still was this idea of racism pervading everything because of the black codes and because of the Jim Crow laws. You have now even a Taney Court of Supreme Court justices who are leaning towards the South. We have a whole presidency that says, fine, we'll abandon what we did in the South because we want to think more about economics in the Republican Party. This is not looking good for America, but this is the story that we have. And thanks again, Golden Bears, for listening, and keep it classy.